Welcome to Straight Up Now Tell Me, Christian conversation that's straight without a chaser. If one were to ask, what is the beauty of Straight Up Now Tell Me? The beauty of Straight Up Now Tell Me is that we have no hidden agenda. We certainly do not, and we have no axe to grind as it relates to anything Christian-wise or otherwise throughout the world. And what that does for us is that it allows us to have great Christian conversation on topics that may not have been approached or I guess covered recently or even openly in the Christian space. And I mentioned that on today simply because of the nature of the topic that we have on board. And our topic for today is on whether or not Christ's church divides or functions to divide. And what I'll say on that, straight out the gate, is that as long as I have been a part of the Christian church, it has been a topic of conversation of whether or not within the Christian church there are certain persons that are in or persons who are out, or whether there are certain persons who have been allowed to be or even expected to be a part of the body of believers, aka the Christian church, or whether or not they were even welcome to be, or whether they were they not welcome to be. And what I'll say again is that there is nothing new under the sun. And I say it often, but in this regard, you might ask, what makes me so sure? And how can I be so confident that this is not a new issue that we are talking about on today? And what I will say is that I am totally convinced that, this topic has been around possibly for centuries, and if not for centuries, then certainly for decades. And how can I be that sure? Well, one bit of evidence I'll say is because there was a gentleman by the name of John Lennon who decades ago penned a song called Imagine. And in that song, John challenged us to imagine a world where things that traditionally divided were not, did not exist. And on that list, was none other than his thought to ask us to imagine a world without religion. And so we'll put a pin in that real quick because to give John his fair due with what he left the world to, for us to consider, there were also other things that he asked that we imagine the world without. And I'll include a couple of those on today simply because I think they're important to our conversation as well. And one thing that John asked us to imagine a world without was to imagine a world without imaginary lines that divide the terrain. And by that, we mean the terrain of the earth. And so what that simply means is to imagine a world where we saw ourselves as a world of one, as citizens of the world and not constrained by, I guess, a thing that, he called countries. And with that, what he was really going after is that, to his point, is that if we did not have those, things that we called countries, then there would be nothing to live or to die for in that space, in that regard. And that we could see ourselves, openly as a brotherhood of man and, a nation of one, a world of one is what he was saying. And with that, I think the second thing that he also challenged us to imagine the world without was to imagine a world without material possessions. And where John was going with that, he actually said that, if we could see ourselves as not, having material possessions and not making that, I guess, being a world of have and have-nots is what he's trying to say. And if we can see ourselves, without that in our space, then we can certainly alleviate the whole notions of greed and poverty. And so that's John's perspective. So he saw a world where if we could rid ourselves of, the whole notion of country and of the whole notion of having to show patriotism to one country over another, and to actually be able to see ourselves again as a world of one, then we could also, also get away from all these other things that he saw to be problematic. And with that, I want to say, just to put a pin there for a second, someone else came along on the notion of countries and offered that even if we could not see ourselves without those imaginary lines that divided the terrain, that if we could view those imaginary lines as zip codes as we do in the States, then we could certainly still accomplish what John Lennon left us to do, is to see ourselves as one. And with that, I guess, there was also someone who came along with the whole notion of whether or not we can live without, this whole notion of material possessions. And they challenged us to do what we asked our children to do every day, and that is simply to share. And with that, the world would be a better place. And so those three things, John, are amongst the things that John Lennon left us to consider, whether or not there could be a world without, lines of demarcation that divide, whether or not there could be a world without material possessions that create this whole notion of the have and the have-nots, and that create this whole thought that he saw of greed and hunger, and I certainly agree with those two, or whether or not we can see ourselves in a world without religion. And so that brings us full circle back to our topic at hand, and whether or not, Christ Church divides. And so a second bit of evidence is that at the mere mention of the fact that there would be a segment on the Christian church, I had someone chomping at the bit, like, put me on, if there's ever, a segment, because they want to talk about, things, how the church has divided, among other things that, are at hand. And not only that, then, the final thing I'll say in this regard, as far as like evidence that this has been around, for any number of years, is that there have certainly been comments made throughout, the states, and probably, I would dare say, throughout the world, of groups, by groups who felt like they have been ostracized by the Christian church as we know it. And so they have, raised an indictment against the Christian church that they have been, I guess, segmented off, and feel that they are, have been divided off, from, being able to openly or fully, participate, or that others have been as well. And so that is why I say that I am quite sure that this is not a new topic at hand. But what I'll say is, along those lines, is that I certainly want to hear from you. And so the plan is that to open the lines of communication. And if you are on that wonderful platform that we call Facebook, that the plan at hand is to allow, everyone, all viewers, to comment on the topic at hand. Does Christ Church divide? Does it divide? And I look forward to hearing from you on the topic. So what I will say, just a couple of things I'll ask, is that you certainly listen to the full podcast before commenting here today, and that you would also identify yourself, in the comment. So as someone who is, formerly a part of, I guess, the Christian church, who may have, segmented off, or may just, have kind of, stopped, I guess, participating as a whole. And I guess, or either if you're someone who's maybe, actively a member, of the Christian church and actively participating in a congregational ministry, say that. Or if you're someone who's, sitting on the sidelines, who, is just, kind of, not, taking a part, and that's okay as well. We just want to know, or even if you're someone who's never been a part, who may not even be interested in it all, but still wants to leave a comment, we just certainly ask that to further our conversation, that, we identify ourselves. And that way, I think it'll help our understanding along the way. So again, I'm looking forward to your comments, and I'm certainly looking forward to reading those and to see, what your thoughts are in this space. But back to, I guess, to the podcast at hand. And what I'll say is that a key question at hand is whether or not the Christian church as we know it, divides. And so, I guess, in furthering that conversation, I guess one thing to ask would be, well, is it divided? And I certainly would argue that, certainly the Christian church has divided. And if we certainly just look at, I guess, the 16th century, Protestant Reformation, where the Protestant church divided from the Catholic church at hand, then that is a key indicator that the church has divided. But, fast forward, until today, and we have these things called denominations. And anyone who's had this conversation with me knows that my standard reply is that denominations are an abomination. And what I mean by that is that they are certainly not what Christ envisioned when he, saw his church. That he would never envision that we would be segmented off into different sects that, actually, only engage one another, very rarely in those regards. And so I would say that, that is certainly, again, not what Christ envisioned for his church, but it is evidence that the church has divided and is divided. And one other thing I'll say about that is that in addition to the whole notion of denominations, that there is evidence that the church has divided in other ways. And so before we go there, though, I want to share, another reason why I say that, that it's not Christ's desire that we be divided denominationally, because I think it helps frame out our mind in a way that I think that he would not want our minds to be framed out. And so what I'll share is that I actually went to a Methodist seminary. And while there, I think the number one thing I'll share just personally on one account is that there were, I guess, I'm trying to think of a very kind way of saying it, that it became problematic in the fact that I was there and I was not Methodist. So when it came to opportunities at the university where to receive scholarship or to I guess benefit in other ways, the key thing that kept coming up is that you're not Methodist. And so I'm like, but I'm Christian, I am a student at this school, at the university. So what is the issue at hand? But it kept coming back to the fact that, you might be an A student, but you are not eligible for anything that, in this space because you are not Methodist. So just another key indicator, just one small example that I would like to offer that, that is an indication of whether or not we are currently divided. And so not only in the space of the Christian church, but also in other Christian organizations as well, is my point. But I also want to say that I guess around 2015, there was a situation where I was invited to be a part, actually to attend a worship service with a friend of mine who's also, a classmate at the seminary that I attended. And so I was invited to join him at his family's church, which was about an hour and a half outside of Washington, D.C. And while there, just wonderful Christian, wonderful, Sunday service. And while I was there, the whole conversation came up about an event that was taking place at the Black church. I'm like, the what? And it's like, the Black church. I'm like, is it painted black? Or is the outside black? Is that the name on the marquee? But, they were like, no, it's at the Black church. So there was this whole notion of the fact that there was a Black church in the city where all the African Americans attended. And I certainly was not at the Black church at the moment. But again, so if we say, has the Christian church divided? I would dare say that not only has it divided, along denominational lines, but it has divided and been divided along racial lines as well. And so, again, I guess the point of the question is whether or not the church is divided. So I would say that yes, it is divided in that regard, but not only racially or maybe denominationally, but I would also say that in certain situations, the church is also divided economically. And what I'll cite in that regard is that, a story that has stuck with me, for any number of years. I have a friend who actually openly participated in a ministry that was geared towards the homeless community in Washington, D.C. And what they would do is that they would provide meals, for persons who were homeless. And they decided that instead of just, providing meals for them, that they would actually bring them in to Sunday service, and so that they could attend, worship service along with the rest of the persons who were there. And the situation that evolved from that is that there became an issue because the persons within the church did not want to have the homeless persons, share the same pew. And I guess if to take this a step further, is that a friend of mine who was involved in this, he actually mentioned it to his dad. And his dad, who actually, lived in another city, they were just having a conversation, and his dad's response was classic. What he said is they saved? And I'm like, excuse me? He's like, no, is they saved? And what he meant by that, and when he was, I guess, asking whether or not they were saved, is whether or not they had come into an understanding of how Christ would have us treat persons who are part of, a homeless community, or part of any community, and whether or not they understood, that's the value that Christ had for those persons, and in his heart and in his mind. And so when he asked, is they saved? That is exactly what he was asking. If the persons who were involved had come into a full understanding of all of that. And so what I'll say is, in all fairness, in order to say if it was purely an economic thing that drove the persons to not want to sit, beside the persons from the homeless community, then in order to determine that, we would have to delve a lot deeper. So we won't chalk that up as clearly an economic decision, but I think there may have been economic factors involved. And so we will say that, but that still, yet it is still an indicator that the Christian church as we know it, has divided. And so even with that, there is still the notion of whether or not the Christian church as we know it should divide. Whether or not, the Christian church should seek to preclude certain individuals or certain groups from being a part. And what I will say in that regard is certainly on whether or not it should divide. I will echo what the Apostle Paul said in a situation that took place during his lifetime. And so there was a situation where there were persons who said, hey, I follow Apollos, which was one of the key teachers of the day. And there were others who say, I follow Paul. And there were still yet others who say, I follow Peter. And, others, I follow Jesus Christ. And what Paul said is Christ divided? And so that is my response on today as it relates to denominations, and is Christ divided? And I would say no. And I think we would all agree that Christ is certainly not divided, and that it is, again, not what he envisioned for his church. And that there is no basis for dividing, based on anything that Christ has said or based on anything that he has done while here on earth. And so I would dare say that his hope for us is that we certainly would be united as one. And so again, we have the whole thing of and so again, one other thing I'll say is that if we were to put the pieces back together denominationally, I think we would have more of a picture again of what Christ envisioned for his church. And so the Catholic Church as we know it, has been known for its generosity, for its care for the poor, and for setting up grants and things of that nature to help persons in need. And then, so if we were to marry that back with the Baptist Church, who does great teaching, right? And so on this Christians in the Christian space, then we would have more of, I guess, what, a thing that would be very beneficial to all of us. And if we were to even, to marry the Methodist Church back, and I say that, in my experience, they have been known to, to champion things that in the social justice space that have, that certainly need to be championed. And if we were to put those things back, and even along with the Eastern Orthodox Church and other churches, there are other Christian churches, then we would have a full spectrum of things that are needed to march forward and to really accomplish the things that would be beneficial in the Christian space. And again, food for thought, and I certainly say once again that would mirror much more of what Christ had in mind. And so one other thing that I will say, one other, I guess, branch of this conversation I'll offer is that biblically, I'll say, on the topic of whether or not we should seek to divide, I think that, Christ has said, I guess, a number of things to us in that regard. But the one thing that I will say is that he, by way of parable, taught us that in all cases, to let the wheat grow with whatever's grown with it. So whether we say, it's a weed or a tear or whatever it is, he was like, no, let it grow together. And I'll deal with it, when it needs to be dealt with. And so Christ is certainly big enough to, to speak for himself and to deal with people on himself if they need to be dealt with. But even by way of that parable, I would argue that it is not Christ's desire that we be divided on any account. But a second thing that I'll say, just real quickly, is that there is the whole account of whether or not, found in Scripture, of whether or not a person who becomes a member of an active part of the Christian church as we know it, whether or not they should depart from their spouse if their spouse is not also a believer. And what has been said in that regard is that you should not, automatically, hop up and decide, I gotta go because, I've joined, the Christian body of believers and my spouse has not. But, the advice is that, no, stay. If they're willing to stay with you, then, you are not, under any obligation to, to run out the door, right? And to leave them there. And what the whole point of that is that you could be a tool to help them come into, the same, relationship, with Christ that you've come into and become a member, a part as well. And so that is, what has been said in that regard. And also what has been offered is that, by your staying, that you can also, if there are, children involved, that you can also, help in that regard, help them, to see the things that come to understand the things that you've also understood. And so that is also an indicator that, that Christ does not seek for us to divide. But the final thing I'll say is something that a friend of mine shared with me on this topic when I mentioned that I was doing the podcast. And what he reminded me of is that the whole notion that there is neither Jew nor Greek, so to speak, Jew nor Gentile, or male nor female, as in regard to Jesus Christ, but we are all one. And so then, I stand on that as well as just another indicator of, the perspective on whether or not the Christian church as we know it should seek to divide. Food for thought, right? But the topic at hand is whether or not Christ's church actually divides. And what I will say along those lines is that there could be situations where there is a need to actually to protect. And if there's a situation where there's a need to protect from active threat or active harm or even from things that are injurious, then of course it's good common sense that the church would put things in place to segment people off who are actively involved in harming someone to preclude them from following through on their actions. So we will say that, and it's just like in our households, any parent will interrupt anything that stands to harm, the household or, the family in general. And so that goes for any walk of life, and even in the workplace where, there's the threat of workplace violence. And so there are things that are put in place to help, alleviate that concern, or either to stop someone who's actively involved in that. And so we're not saying that there is never a situation, where the Christian church, as we know it, should not seek to, to divide per se, to segment off in a situation where there's an active, harm that's going on. So that's just good common sense, and we're not arguing that at all. So we'll take that off the table per se. But what we are saying is that that we have to admit that there have been certain situations where the Christian church, as we know it, has divided. One group from another. And so we can't skirt past that, whether or not it was the quote unquote black church or quote unquote the white church. Whatever the case, there have been situations where the Christian church as we know it has divided, right? Or one group from another. So, we'll admit it, and, we'll hang our hat on that, as we say on today. But even with that, we'll take it a step further and say that there are persons who have been unjustly segmented off from the Christian church. And so, even if we go back, years ago, in the case of John Lennon, and what we will say is that, John Lennon caught heat from the Christian church and from, throughout the United States in general, because of his marriage to someone that was from another country. And so his wife was from, of Asian descent. And so he caught heat regarding that. And so that is a clear indicator that, there are times when the church has divided along racial lines, right? And not only that, there are persons who have been, segmented off and unjustly, alienated simply because, on the basis of their sexual orientation. And that is a total podcast in and of itself. But, hold that thought, because what I want to say in that regard is that if we look at what Christ has done, right, while here on earth, and how he has treated persons he's come in contact with, that is our model for what we are to do, right? And this podcast is about, our response to anything. So we're not saying that you have to agree, and we're not saying that you have to, to even like, whatever is going on. But what we are saying is that, we are called to love as God would have us to love. And so God says, I will not forget the love that you have shown me, meaning God, as you have helped my people and continue to do it. And so he didn't segment off who the help was, going to be, I guess, directed to, or where the love was supposed to be directed to. And again, whether or not we agree, or whether or not, anything, whether or not we understand, right? Our responsibility is not to be injurious to anyone. And what I will say is that the body of believers has been actively injurious to, persons of the LGBT community. And I will not skirt past that, and only because, it draws me back to a time where there were persons during the civil rights movement of the 1960s who knew that what was taking place was wrong, but that they sat silently in that regard, and mainly because that, if to speak would be, to be considered a Negro lover, so to speak. And so I will not sit silently in that regard and really allow that community to be injured. I'm not a part of the community, but just like those persons in this, civil rights movement of the 1960s who were not a part of the African American community to sit silently while it's going on is certainly, an error in my mind, right? And so, I pause for today to say that as well. But there are persons who have been unjustly, segmented off, right? And amongst them are persons, of the LGBT community as well. But even to, to go further, there are still, persons who've been segmented off as well, in economically. And I'll dare say that persons, there have been persons who exist in the inner cities of the United States who have still been, sort of segmented off in certain regards, and not in every situation, but certainly in a number of situations as well. But I just want to offer that as part of our conversation on today. And what I'll also say that in our conversations to come, that my request is that we not be injurious to any person or any group that has been mentioned here on this podcast in our comments that are to come. And the reason why is because I believe that there has been enough injury inflicted, and that Christ has called us to lift him up, and for all to see. And so that that's all I will say in that regard on today. But again, certain things are for a full podcast in and of itself. In order for us to really to flesh them out and to talk about. But I wanted to pause there on today to say those things. And so one thing I will echo as it relates again, I guess, to our conversation about persons of different sexual orientations is that I'll say what one professional athlete and celebrity has said is that it changes nothing about our love for them, and it changes nothing about our responsibility to do the things towards them that Christ would have us do, and that is to love, right, and to lift him up, and for the world to see. And so we'll go on with the conversation, and what I will say is that I have to say, on Straight Up Now Tell Me, that there have been situations in which the Christian church, as we know it, has divided. But our topic of conversation on today is whether or not Christ's church divides, and not the Christian church as we know it. And Christ's church certainly does not divide. The one that Christ envisioned does not divide. And please, I'll say, hear my heart when I say that, because by no stretch of the imagination am I saying that the Christian church that as we know it is not Christ's church. But what I am saying is that in certain regards, and in this regard, we have missed the mark of what Christ intended as it relates to his church by dividing. And, why would I say that? What basis do I have for, saying that? Is that, simply by what we witness Christ doing while here on earth. And what we find him doing is that, we don't find him doing anything other than that. We find him approaching persons who, that we may not have thought that he would approach, right? And so one thing we find him is, meeting, persons along the way who other persons had said were outcast, a Samaritan woman along the way, right? And so we find him, meeting a woman at the well who may have been involved in all kinds of things that, persons in society may have said that she should not have been. And so, maybe even Christ would have said it. But we find him encountering her at the well and, offering her living water, right? And so not only that, we find him going after persons, of every, I guess, economic bracket. There was nothing there. We find him going after persons who were, demon possessed. There was no one who was outside of the love of Christ while here on earth. And so what I will say in addition to that is that the church that Christ envisioned, points persons back to Christ in every situation, right? And stands on the promise that if he is lifted up, if we lift him up as we do, that, that he would draw all persons to him. And so I think, based on that, there is no basis for us to shun, certain groups. There is no basis for us to ostracize anyone. But it's, our primary thing is to, point persons to Christ and to lift Christ up, as I have said, that he would draw all persons to him. And certainly Christ is big enough to speak for his own self, right? And so we do not need to actively be a part of anything that divides. Food for thought. And not even food for thought, things to consider deeply, right? But again, what I will say in addition to that is that we at Straight Up Now Tell Me look forward, to feedback in every regard. And we certainly are part of the Christian of Christ Church, right? The Christian, body of believers. And this podcast, as we say, is not directed towards, primarily towards persons who meet in the congregational ministry alone. It's for all of us, whether or not wherever we find ourselves, who call ourselves, Christians, right? And so please, keep that in mind. So, everything that we've discussed about our responsibility on today applies to persons who may, represent us or be a part of us as we're on social media, or, who may be a part of us. They may not be part of a congregational ministry, but, who represent us in the workplace. So, the things that we want to put forward and to consider. And so the question on the table might be, so why have the conversation? So why bring up the fact that the Christian church as we know it has divided? And what I'll say to that is that for a number of reasons. One is that we would be mindful of the fact that, certain things that we do as the Christian body of believers, have impact and have lasting impact, and you can be hurtful to persons who are seeking to be a part of the community and who are a part of Christ Church. And so to keep that in mind. But another reason to bring it up is because I guess, any good, line of thought says that, we have to acknowledge that there is an issue in order to work on that issue. And so how do we get back to being more on this topic, for being more of what Christ had in mind, what he envisioned? And I'll say that we get back there by, making one small choice at a time, and to making one, decision at a time, to really to invite Christ in on this, and to allow him to guide us on this whole notion of how to not be divided as his church. And then, we invite Christ in, but then we also have to do, what we know that he is asking us to do. So two parts, we have to, to invite him in, and then to actually actively do what he would have us to do. And so I want to share that on today as a pathway forward for all of us. And I certainly, when I say we, I certainly mean we. Right? So just want to share that in that regard as well. So again, what we'll say is thank you again for, joining us on Straight Up Now Tell Me. And we again look forward to the open dialogue that is certainly ours. And we look forward to, open discussion on, everything that's we've discussed here on today. Right? And so again, thank you, and have a wonderful day and, and a wonderful week.